Welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Miles series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, an Emeritus Professor at what is now City St George's, University of London, and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the city, and a liveryman of the Stationers' Company. And I'll be convening the session today and moderating the questions and answers. So very quickly, this is the plan for today. Introduction from me, the keynote presentation from Her Honour Wendy Joseph KC, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. Today we have a really good topic, from court to icon, how the Old Bailey became the most famous court in the world. So I'm delighted to welcome Her Honour Judge Wendy Joseph KC. Firstly, Wendy, can you tell us something about yourself?
Well, it's been a long life, and all of that working life, I've been a lawyer in the criminal courts, first as a junior barrister, then as a Queen's Counsel, now King's Counsel, and finally as a judge, mostly at the Old Bailey. I retired from there in 2022, and the job had meant so much to me that I began to write about it. There are 2 books out now, and they both really do the same thing. They say to the reader, come and sit beside me on the bench. Come and see what it's really like. I care a lot about the Old Bailey, and perhaps by the time I've finished, some of you will too.
Right, well now, can you tell us more? From court to icon, so how is it that the Old Bailey became the most famous court in the world? Over to you.
Well, how did it all begin? A very long time ago. Once upon a medieval time, a king determined to curb the bad behaviour of his subjects. London was flooded with men returning from the Crusades who had rather lost sight of the niceties of living with neighbours, and Henry II decided to deal with it. He criminalised all sorts of antisocial behaviour, thereby turning into criminals all sorts of people who were behaving antisocially. And once you say someone is a criminal, you have to do something about it. You have to put them before a court, which Henry found himself short of. He had a queue of malefactors waiting to be tried, and since in those days such people were remanded into jails until trials, he had to find cells in which to put them, and he found himself short of those too. He filled the Tower of London, then he filled every other jail, and he began to look for new places of incarceration. His eye fell on the Newgate, the latest of the city gates to be built with its smart, well-staffed guardrooms. It stood at the top of a little road called Old Bailey. Convenient enough, thought Henry, and he put his prisoners into its guardrooms, and then, when he needed them, built more cells along the adjacent lane. And the rest is history. The sprawling footprint of Newgate Prison was established, and it would last, for good or ill, mainly ill, for nearly 700 years. By the 16th century, a court had been built adjacent to it. A short time afterwards, certainly by the 1600s, a tunnel had been built for prisoners to pass through from the jail to this new court. The court was open periodically because it was an assize court, and it is that which was to become the Central Criminal Court, known across the world as the Old Bailey. It's obvious, I suppose, that it got its name from the little road on which it stood, and it began as a single courtroom. Then another was added, but no more than 2, and for a very long time. And also for a very long time, the courts were open to the elements. This was an attempt, not always successful, to prevent the judges, the barristers, the jurors, even the witnesses, catching jail fever of which there was plenty in Newgate. The court itself, of course, was tiny compared to the size of Newgate, and that whole complex underwent a number of developments and rebuildings over the centuries. In fact, the history of Newgate, the sort of people who were there, the sort of things that happened there, is a fascinating study in itself. But this talk is about the Old Bailey. And the Old Bailey, as you know it today, emerged, at least in the part of what you see today, only in the 20th century. It happened like this. In 1902, the infamous Newgate, partly stimulated by debate by Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Fry, was finally demolished. 5 years later, there emerged from the ashes, phoenix-like, the building which today houses half the Old Bailey complex. It houses courts 1 to 4 and 17 and 18. Now, I could tell you, I suppose, about the cases that took place there, but honestly, they are a matter of record and anyone can look them up. You can go and look up in the Old Bailey archives, in fact, cases which have taken place in the Old Bailey courts since 1684. There's records of them all, some very full, some very sketchy, but they're there for anyone to go and look at. What I'd like to do today, if you don't mind, is to come at the whole question of the Old Bailey from a different perspective. Let's start with the building. There was a competition to design it, won by a man called Edward Mountford. There was a competition to paint its murals, won by a man called Gerald Moira. There was fierce competition to top it with something appropriate, and that commission was awarded to Frederick William Pomeroy. You may not know much about the paintings and statues inside the building, but you will certainly know Pomeroy's iconic figure, sometimes called Nemesis, sometimes Justice, or the Lady of Justice. She stands atop the building, carrying in her right hand the sword of retribution, in her left the scales of justice. She is not, as you might think, blindfolded, because to do justice you need all your faculties about you. She is what makes this building identifiable across the world, and it is fitting that it is this figure of justice which has become synonymous with the system that Great Britain gave to that world. But you know, no one out there in the world would recognise the fine and functional 60s adjunct, which tripled the number of courtrooms in the building. Few have any idea of the maze of corridors and areas dedicated to barristers, judges, witnesses, and jurors, or the large parts of the building where the city runs its business, where the sheriffs live and work, where the good and the great are entertained. It is that image of the figure of justice which resonates everywhere it is seen. We think of it, I think, as a symbol of the civilised society which this country hoped to portray, and it is an image that belongs to the Old Bailey. The emergence of the Old Bailey parallels, indeed it's part of, the rise of the City of London. Its sheriffs live there, its Lord Mayors are its friends, the Old Bailey's judges are the city's judges, and the Old Bailey's senior judge, the Recorder of London, currently Mark Lucraft KC, is appointed by the Crown on the recommendation of the City of London Corporation with the concurrence of the Lord Chancellor. The Old Bailey is intrinsic to the city, but it is also, and of course, the central criminal court of this country, and it enforces the criminal law, which applies across the whole country. And since those laws are largely now enacted in Parliament, it is a sort of living link between Westminster and the city, a symbol of things being done as they should be done to achieve justice, or that's what we like to think. And that, you might conclude, is why the English legal system is one not only respected across the world, but actually sought out by the world, why so many others come here for resolution of their commercial disputes, because they believe in our system. But if they think that that has anything to do with a figure on the Old Bailey, you and they are wrong. Because she presides over criminal justice, and that is more different than you may think from the civil courts, which are most famous across the world. The civil courts, which deal in contracts and commercial law and tortious law and land and property and shipping and patents and many, many, many other things. They could not be more different from our criminal courts as represented by the Old Bailey. To understand why the criminal world of the Old Bailey is so important, it is worth just trying to grasp some of those essential differences between the criminal and the civil courts. For example, civil justice generally involves disputes between two or more parties who have got themselves into some sort of relationship and then wish they hadn't. In those cases, a judge listens to the arguments, applies the law, makes a finding. He orders Bob to pay Harry the money Harry would have got if only Bob had done what he should have done, and Bob's your uncle, justice is done, things are put right. That's what happens in a civil court, but it's not what happens in a criminal court. In criminal courts, the word justice has a very different meaning, because in crime, you can't put things right. You can't undead a body on the mortuary slab. You can't unrape a violated woman. Judges in criminal courts can punish, they can try to deter, they can hope to rehabilitate, but they can't put things right. And you know, at the Old Bailey, when I was sitting as a judge, I would see that in the faces of the bereaved family. When the verdict of guilty of murder is returned, you see their moment of triumph. When the inevitable sentence of life imprisonment is passed on the killer of their child, sibling, parent, you see the moment of vengeance. And then you see the blankness as realization dawns on them that nothing is any better, that their loved one is still dead, and nothing in the universe will undo it. So, crime overturns not only the lives of the bereaved, of the victims, it undermines all our lives, because it undermines the peaceful, ordered process and the security of our society. And this is what makes the criminal courts so special. Unlike any other courts, they, represented by the Old Bailey, are about us, all of us, and everything about the way they function bespeaks this. Let me give you an example. Let's take the parties involved. In civil cases, the parties are the people who got themselves mixed up in the events complained of. Not so in a criminal court. There, one of the parties, the prosecutor, is us, at least our representative, because the prosecutor is almost always the Crown representing us all. Then there's the law, which the criminal courts, like the Old Bailey, applies. It is these days largely statutory. That is to say, it is created by our Parliament. That is to say, it is created by those we have elected to decide what laws are necessary so that we can all lead peaceful and secure lives. These criminal laws are designed to protect you, your family, your friends, your neighbours' neighbours, every last one of us, because a criminal act is an offence against us all. Here's a third huge difference that marks out courts like the Old Bailey from the civil courts. In criminal courts, the big decision, guilty or not guilty, is not made by the judge. It's made by you. That is to say, it is made by the jury, which is you or people like you, people who care enough about their society to put their name on the electoral register and thereby make themselves eligible for jury service. The decision, guilty or not guilty, is made by the very people that the laws are there to protect. We give this fundamental task to 12 ordinary people, and let's face it, 12 ordinary people of greater or less education, intelligence, bias. We send them off to do it in the privacy of a jury room, utterly unsupervised, with no comeback or way of reviewing their process. You know, if we were starting from scratch, and I suggested that as a system, I'd get a few raised eyebrows. And yet it works. It's slow, cumbersome, expensive, and yet it works. There's something magic and indeed moving about watching 12 strangers leave their own problems, their own lives, and settle down for weeks, even months, working together to solve our problems. You can criticize the system, but show me a better one. Of course, the judge isn't entirely redundant in a criminal court. The judge, he or she, has a large number of roles. One of them is, if the jury returns a guilty verdict, to pass the sentence. But that sentence must be within the range provided by legislation and guidelines, and those, again, are, above all, designed to make society be and feel that it is secure. I suppose what we do is we take offenders who undermine the smooth running of our society and we punish them, yes, but we hope to rehabilitate them. And if they can't be rehabilitated, if they remain dangerous, we remove them from us by locking them up. The underlying aim of it all is to make society, us, safe. That being so has a number of consequences. For example, because we recognize that everyone has a stake in this system, we ensure that it is open to everyone to see and hear and hopefully understand. That's why every criminal court has a public gallery, why each has a place where the press can sit and listen and report. You know, even when the case involves aspects that mean reporting cannot happen immediately. For example, it may be there's another linked case to follow. Even then, although reporting may be delayed, it's vanishingly rare that it can be denied finally. And when there are things, very rarely, but it happens occasionally, that it is not in society's interest to have reported in full, any limitations imposed by the judge must be the minimum possible, consistent with justice. And all of these things, that the criminal court deals with breaches of law made by our society, that the prosecutions are brought in the name of that society, that the big decision is made by members of that society, that sentences are passed to satisfy the moral and physical needs of our society. All that is because it is a system that is there for all of us. Most of us, certainly us judges, are proud of it. Of course we are. But we should understand how fragile these things can be. Their survival depends on people, ordinary people, caring. And though they grumble, for example, about jury service, once they get involved in a case, they do care, and they care selflessly. The system depends also on barristers being willing to do criminal work. And let's face it, it's common knowledge, criminal work, being publicly funded, yields a markedly smaller income than private civil work. But, at least until relatively recently, barristers have been willing to make that sacrifice, to do this work that is so interesting and so genuinely important. I suppose above all, the system we have depends on an able and independent judiciary. How vital it is that our judges are beyond the reach of the executive. And I say that because you only have to look at other countries, some other countries, to understand how fortunate we are to have this system, and how we must grapple it to our breast, and how we must fight against any incursion on that precious thing. But you know, ultimately, the whole thing depends on proper funding, which must come from the state, because where else can it come from? And here the system is constantly under threat. To come back to the Old Bailey, in this of all criminal courts, the Old Bailey is again unique, because its building is not owned or leased by the Ministry of Justice, but it is owned and maintained by the City of London. The Ministry of Justice rents out parts of the building for its work and pays its judges, but it's the city that cares for it, that looks after it, that makes sure the roofs aren't leaking and that the heating works. It is the city that makes sure it functions so that the judges, the jurors can continue their work there. So, finally, this icon, this Old Bailey, it represents much more than a court system. It represents more than justice in general. It certainly represents more than the law. I reckon it represents the very core of our society and how we believe it should function. Now, of course, it's hugely important that those across the world so respect our entire court system that they come here to use its civil aspects. This respect makes us important in many ways, internationally. But for my money, it's the fact that the Old Bailey, the central criminal court with its towering figure of justice, has become and remains the iconic court across the world, which is so significant. And it is significant because it speaks of what, may I dare to say it in this context, is more important than business and money. It speaks of our attitude towards our people and how we believe everyone in our society should be able to live. May it continue and flourish forever.
Oh, that was a splendid, splendid appeal for everyone to support the legal system to the best of their ability. Interesting question in terms of the Old Bailey being in the city. It's so much of a city institution in a way, but of course has a completely national reach. But what happens with the Royal Courts of Justice, which are about 100 yards outside the city boundary? What do they do at the Royal Courts of Justice?
Oh, the Royal Courts of Justice are a beast of a very different nature.
Ah,
A lot of different things happen there. There is a lot of uh, quite serious first instance civil work done there in its
right.
many courtrooms. But from the public's point of view, the thing they will know about it is it's where our Court of Appeal sits. The Court of Civil and Criminal Appeals
Right.
sit there. So that's one level beneath the Supreme Court, but it is the appeal courts from all first instance criminal courts and civil courts.
So
And so
that's when I go by on the bus, I see the demonstrations in the morning. Uh,
that's what you're
yes.
saying. That's exactly it, Tim.
It is a splendid building, I must say. When you go in, it's absolute. There's this enormous hall, but some years ago I was training court interpreters, and we were using some of the little courtrooms at the back. It's an absolute rabbit warren. I think we were in court 57 or something like that.
Yes, you
Um,
would have been.
no, um, just to round off the question of the civil versus criminal, etc. Where do the magistrates' courts sit in all of this? Because I believe it's said that most justice actually goes through the magistrates' courts. Would that be true?
Yes, it is. Almost every criminal case starts in the magistrate's court, and almost everyone finishes there. I think about 90% of cases finish there because they are at a level where either they are not serious enough or not deemed to be serious enough to be sent to the Crown Court, or because there's a choice about where trial takes place and both sides, for one reason or another, end up in the magistrate's court. The magistrate's court are staffed by some judges who are appointed to sit at that level, but it is to a large extent staffed by what we call justices of the peace, who are effectively volunteering their skills and their time to sit in benches of three. And they, by and large, across the country, are dealing with the majority of the cases heard in the magistrates' court. And then, if the magistrates find guilt, they may dispose of the case there. But if, when they look at a defendant's antecedents, they found he's done it 57 times before, then they can send it up to the Crown Court for sentence.
Ah, that's interesting. Of course, thinking of who actually manages the courts, the City of London connection again, the sheriffs actually live at the Old Bailey during their year in office, don't they? And they're sort of
Yes.
responsible for the day-to-day running?
Well, the city, the corporation, runs the building. The sheriffs are a constant presence there, which is really nice for the judges because we get to know them as colleagues and friends. The sheriffs run the dining room, so the judges are the guests of the sheriffs for lunch every day. And the sheriffs invite other guests that the city wants to host. So the great and the good, or the less great and the less good, and we all end up having lunch together.
Oh, right. Yes. Well, I've actually had lunch in the Bailey a couple of times. I think I'm discounted from being either great or good, but there we go. Now, Peter Cousins has come up with a good one for you. It's sometimes said that as much law is made by the lawyers as by Parliament. And in his experience of the civil courts, there is some truth in that. Do you think there's any truth in that in the criminal courts?
Very little these days. There are two ways in which our laws historically have been made. One was by precedent, that is to say, a senior court would come up with a ruling and the lesser courts then had to apply it. And the other was by statute. In the criminal law, increasingly, we have statutory law, and there's not very much common law left now, but there is some. There is some.
Oh, that's a pity. I rather like the idea of common law. It reminds me of Robin Hood. Now, I'm afraid money rears its ugly head almost straight away. John Taylor is asking, thank you, an excellent presentation. What should be done to ensure sufficient funding? Who's going to pay for all of this?
Yeah, it's such a difficult question. Everything in life these days is treasury driven. And if I were given the brief, I could make an excellent case for pouring money into the courts, into the bar so the courts are properly staffed, into the prisons so that we can do something about the prisoners we've got there. But if I were the mother of a child dying of cancer, or the daughter of someone who was on dialysis, I could make an equally strong case for the spending of money in other ways. I could make a very strong case for the spending of money to look after the elderly and those who have a very tough time just negotiating our world. There is such demands on our money. And there's a limited pot of it. I'm
Yes.
grateful it isn't me who has to make these decisions, but I do point out that the failure to properly fund the criminal justice system has the sorts of consequences that we are seeing now, with the barristers draining away, with not enough cell space, with no way of properly watching over, caring for prisoners when they come out. It's not pretty.
Yes, interesting about caring for prisoners, because we had a very interesting lecture, the 11th of July, if anyone wants to follow up on it, a project called No Going Back with the Sheriffs and Recorders Fund. 40 livery companies have come together to help prisoners on their release. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it is worthwhile looking at who ends up in prison. I don't know whether anyone listening knows this, but over 50% of our prisoners in this country are functionally illiterate. 47% have a reading age at level 1 or less. That is the level we would hope for from a 5-year-old. If you stop and think how impossible it is just to function in our society if you can't read, if you stop and think how it narrows, I'm not just able to function, but to function as a proper human being. I used to see again and again and again in the dock kids who seemed not to be able to empathize with those they'd hurt. I don't think it was because they were autistic or anything else. I think it's because they hadn't learned to empathize. And one of the ways in which we do learn to appreciate how other characters around us are feeling and reacting is by reading, which takes you into the head of another character and shows you that. And I think that the failure to deal with the huge illiteracy problem is I'm not going to say a major, but a very significant plank in offending in this country and in our failure to cope with the problem of reoffending. And one of the things I'm working on is a project in a prison, which will spread if it continues to be successful, to try and tackle that.
Yes, yes, many years ago I had some connection with the Prison Education Service, and I think literacy tuition was probably one of the most important things that was being done. Now, Jill Hamilton has a query with regards to barristers. If they're acting for people in criminal matters in England, are they actually paid for by the government?
They are paid for out of the budget of the Ministry of Justice. So yes, they are.
Oh,
They
gosh,
are.
right.
It all comes out of your taxes, is the answer.
Yes, in fact, we pay for it, but there we are. Yes,
As
coming back.
is.
Yes, coming back to the matter of the actual the Bailey itself, is it possible for the public to, I know you can sit in on a court case, but is it possible to have a guided tour of the Old Bailey? Can anyone actually go around it?
You can't just go around it. You can go into any public gallery, and there are separate entrances.
Yes, so what, you can actually book a tour of the Bailey,
I
basically?
don't know. There aren't regular tours, but there are lots of organisations that apply to the Old Bailey for a space to go around it, and that can be achieved. So you can go around
Right.
the inside of the building, which you can't do as a member of the public.
Oh, right, right. Yes, of course. I mean, security must be a very serious issue.
Yeah.
One other thing, interesting thing about justice in the city is the Salisbury Square building that's going on at the moment. I understand that, I mean, when you go down Fleet Street, if you're going towards St Paul's, there's this massive building site to the right, which is going to become Salisbury Square, and I believe that's going to have a fairly large number of courtrooms in it, and also I think the City of London Police are relocating there. Do you know when that might be finished by any chance?
I don't, and I don't even know exactly what they are hoping to deal with there, but I think that it will be the most enormous complex and will deal with many different sorts of things that are difficult to accommodate at the moment in a court like the Old Bailey. For example, big frauds.
Yes. Yes, well, of course, the City of London Police does take a national lead on the matter of fraud, so I understand there's going to be a fairly important centre for that there as well.
I think so.
So it's very interesting, really, isn't it? I mean, we've got this courtroom going back to Henry II. Dickens and the Thackeray both write about a public execution taking place actually outside Newgate Prison and reporting on the sheer horror of it. And of course, this is the location. It's number one court, isn't it? That's the celebrated one.
It
Is it
is.
Dr. Crippen, Oscar Wilde, Lord Haw Haw? All sorts of, I suppose, notorious characters have appeared there. So perhaps this is why the Bailey is so much in people's mind. But I really must ask one question. I'm sure we've all either seen or read Rumpole of the Bailey. Um, are those stories actually based on real judges? I mean, do members of the legal profession remember or recall with affection the sort of characters who appear in Rumpole's stories?
Um, I rather suspect him. They imagine they remember them because we've all grown up with Rumpo. I mean, they are caricatures, but they
Yeah,
are enduring caricatures.
yeah, yes. No, they're wonderful stories, I must admit. Now, what about televising the Old Bailey? Is there is anything actually filmed, or is there anything actually recorded visually, or do you have sound recordings in the Bailey during a trial?
Well, we used to have all the evidence and all the legal arguments and everything that happened in the courtroom recorded by stenographers. They
Yes.
have long gone, and they are now recorded by an audio device called
Ah,
DART. And everything is recorded by darts, but it is not publicly available. You can apply for something to be released, but that will be reviewed by a judge. So that is not what you're talking about. You're talking about
right.
you're talking about public exposure of what's going on in the courtroom. At the moment, we have at the Old Bailey and indeed in every court the facility to record sentencing remarks. So, not the trial itself, but if there is a verdict of guilty, a judge passing sentencing remarks, because that is thought in certain cases to be of real interest to the general public. That is comparatively rare. It happens in very serious cases where there's been a great deal of public interest. If you're asking me, do I think that trials will be broadcast? The answer is, first, I don't think they will be, and secondly, I very much hope they won't be.
No, I
Because
heartily concur with that, I must admit.
one only has to look at what happens in America to see the
Yeah.
dangers that are implicit in doing that.
Yes, I think that's a very, very strong point indeed. Now we're coming to the end, but there's something I came across which I really must comment on. The Church of St Sepulchres is just opposite the Old Bailey, Wren Church, worth a visit. And in 1605, I'm sure he was well-meaning, but the execution bell was presented to the Church of St Sepulchres and was actually used for 200 years. And at midnight before an execution, the bell would toll 12 times outside the cell of the unfortunate condemned person. And the following was read out: "All you that in the condemned hole do lie, prepare you for tomorrow you shall die. Watch all and pray, the hour is drawing near, that you before Almighty God will appear. Examine well yourselves, in time repent, that you not to eternal flames be sent. And when St Sepulchre's bell tomorrow tolls, the Lord above have mercy on your souls." Very Dickensian, even as early as 1605. But there we are. Now, I'm sorry we don't have any more time for that. It's a firm Gresham tradition to start on time and finish on time. But that has been a fascinating insight into the Bailey and the way that the legal system works. And if you're interested in these matters, as I say, the webinar of the 11th of July on no going back is well worth a look. Let's have a quick look now as what's coming up. Plenty of things here, very topical subject. On the 15th of October, humanitarian surgery in Gaza, work being done by medical field teams. We switch straight over then with looking at council tax, which is not a popular topic, and an alternative of a green land value tax. No idea what that is, so do tune in on the 17th of October to find out. And intellectual property, which is a subject, I suppose, which actually comes up at times at the Royal Courts of Justice. But IP, we're being told, is a business matter and not a legal one. So all you legal beagles might like to go and have a look at that. Coming in for your interest and for supporting the Lord Mayor's lectures, and especially a thank you to Her Honour Judge Wendy Joseph KC, and indeed the Worshipful Company of Pewterers, one of our great livery companies, for their sponsorship. Now, this lecture, all our lectures are recorded, posted on the Gresham Society website, and they go out on our YouTube channel. And in case you'd like to revisit anything, you also get the questions and answers. And we hope to see you all again soon for another lecture in the Knowledge Miles series. And don't forget the Lord Mayor's theme for the year, which is coming to an end now, of course, which is Connect to Prosper. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, audience, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.